Welcome to the 24th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. I'm still recovering from a flu, so now and then I might have a cough. So I'm doing this sub-series on narratives about civilization, and so today the narrative is about what African and Africa contributes to this discussion about a new world civilization. But before doing that, let's look into what's happening in Palestine. Last week, obviously, a major event was the killing of Hamas Political Bureau Deputy Chairman Saleh al-Aruri in Lebanon. And then the other thing, 2 days later, that was on January the 2nd, the bombing in Iran, which costed the lives of more than 100 people at the city of Kerman at a commemoration of the killing of General Soleimani. These were major setbacks, and it's indicating how the struggle is being intensified on the international level. In the north of Israel, in South Lebanon, the fighting escalates, and sometimes you wonder who wants to escalate the war. And more, I get a feeling that it is Israel pressing the United States so that they can get involved in a wider war against the whole axis of resistance and ultimately Iran. And but it's good to see what the strategy of the resistance is. And an interview with the martyred deputy chief of Hamas, al-Aruri, he gave an interesting interview before October 7, on August 25. And then he explained the strategy of Hamas. He says, a total war has become inevitable. The context is this. The whole discussion on a two-state solution, the discussion on a two-state solution has become in a dead end. So what's the way forward? And the idea in the PLO and those corners is basically accept defeat and live with it and be bribed by the hundreds of millions that you get from the European Union and the United States. But the people of Palestine never accept defeat. And al-Aruri is saying that they are preparing for a total war. It has become inevitable, he says. We all consider it necessary. We want it. At the resistance axis, the Palestinian people in our nation, we want this total war. It's not just something we say in the media. We talk about it behind closed doors. You are meeting with all the parties that will take part in this total war, meaning Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, the Yemenis, Syria, possibly even Turkey. And he says, we are discussing together the different scenarios and possibility. We are convinced that it is possible for us. Know that it is possible, not that it is impossible. He says, we will certainly defeat them. And he continues, wars have changed. The war will not be like the one in 1967 when the Israeli Air Force destroyed Arab air forces and then was free to hunt down the Arab armies. This will not happen again. The war in Ukraine changed things. There are precision weapons, smart weapons, cyber warfare. War has changed and the means of war have changed. Even the weapons have changed. The classical warfare of regular armies has changed, as proved by the Ukrainian war. Since the foundation, Israel has relied on its superiority in classical warfare. They themselves are surprised by the new achievements of weapons which can be obtained by non-state entities. This is meaning the rockets, the rocket-propelled grenades that destroys tanks. Therefore, we are convinced that if a total war begins, the airspace and seaports of this entity will be shut down, and they will not be able to live without electricity, water, and communication. In an open way, they will have a curfew and the economy will come to a standstill. So he's saying we are preparing for a war that is not just about, sending some rockets into the different cities. We are preparing for a war where we shut down the airspace and seaports. And basically, he's saying we're going to liberate the land of Palestine, not just a segment, Gaza, the land of Palestine. And we are going to do it with all the forces of resistance. So the question is now, when? When will you have an all-out war? And you see that is growing gradually. The Said Nasrallah, the General Secretary of Hezbollah, gave a speech, two speeches in fact, last week, Wednesday and Friday, and he talked about what would happen after the Gaza war, meaning that the Gaza war might end with a stalemate for now. And he said that even that war will end with the total liberation of Lebanon, meaning that the territories that Israel is occupying of Lebanon, the territories of Lebanon, the Sheba farms and those, they will be liberated during this war. That is what he's saying. And he gives a recap of how the war has developed since October 7th in the north of Israel. He says Hezbollah carried out almost 700 operations, destructed 84 border sites, 11 rear sites, attacked 17 settlements and 50 border points. Israel doesn't disclose the real numbers of deaths. Israel's talking about 12,000 people, 13,000 people that have been wounded. But how many, that is not disclosed. And he said that if Israel goes on an all-out war on Lebanon, then Hezbollah will respond without limit. And you see now that the Iraqi forces fighting the US and even the Iraqi government and parliament are now wanting to make a final end of the American occupation of Iraq. So things are moving, and obviously what the Houthis are doing by blocking the shipping to Israel is a major event also, causing billions of dollars of damage to the Israeli economy. Interesting thing that I found when we talk about decolonizing the mind is an article that explains how CNN conforms to the Israeli censorship, where the CNN journalists are taught to use the Israeli terminology, avoid using genocide, talk about neutral terms, using neutral terms, and the manipulation of terminology in general. Interesting to see how these people are very conscious about what they are doing. So let's get back now to the sub-series on civilization. The aim of this sub-series is to look into how a new world civilization will come about after the decline and the final defeat of the colonial world civilization in its political form as it is now, with Western political and economic hegemony. And I look into how China, India, Russia has contributed Abhyayala to this discussion. The African contribution is very complex because we're not talking about one country, a few countries. We're talking about a whole continent And you're talking about the whole African diaspora. So it will take some time to explain this in detail, but I will do it because I think it's important. So this episode will be somewhat longer than the others. Now look at Africa as a continent and compare its population with the rest of the world. Then the large countries, India, China, if you look Europe, um, China has 1.4 billion people. India, more or less the same. Africa is somewhat more than the others, has 1460 million, so 1.46 billion. USA has 340 million, Europe 740 million population. So the continent as a whole is big, but it is so fractured in many countries. Even if you look in terms of surface, the area, United States has 9 million square kilometers of surface area. China 9, India 2, Europe 22, Africa 31. So the potential is very big. We're talking about a large continent. If you look at the resources of Africa, the economic potential is huge. Africa holds natural resources, uh, uh, very important one. 98% of world's chromium, 90% of cobalt, 90% of platinum, 70% of coltan, 70% of tantalite, 64% of manganese, 50% of gold, 33% of uranium, as well as significant shares of the world reserves of other minerals such as bauxite, diamond, tantalum, stainless, and tin. It holds 30% of all mineral reserves, 12% of known oil reserves, 8% of natural gas, and 65% of the world's arable land. So, if this was a united country with this strong leadership, it would be probably world number one in many aspects. Look at the geography of it. There are a few countries who have more than 100 million people. Nigeria has almost 200 million, Ethiopia 100, Egypt 100. So we are talking about a few countries that are very big in Africa itself. Religion-wise, the north of Africa has Islam as the main religion. The middle and going down to the south, you have Christianity, and then there are a few pockets, important pockets of, let's say, classical African native philosophies and religions. So, if you want to look into the contribution that Africa will make to the discussion on the world civilization, you have to take into account this diversity where philosophical traditions came outside of Africa into Africa, like Islam, which came from Western Asia, Christianity came from Western colonialism, socialism and liberalism came from the European Enlightenment, basically also the result of Western colonialism. Pan-Africanism as a response to colonialism, uh, arguing for a common history and destiny of Africans. And then you have the indigenous philosophy in Africa from traditional cosmologies. Um, I'll talk about that. And then you have all kinds of ideas that have been developed outside of Africa in the African diaspora. If you look at Islamic countries in Africa, there are 54 countries in Africa, of which certainly 16 have a majority population of Muslims: Mauritania, Somalia, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan, Libya, Senegal, Nigeria, Mali, Gambia, Egypt, Guinea, Niger, Sierra Leone, Chad. And if you look into countries that have a population that is overwhelmingly Christian, then you're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Rwanda, Equatorial Guinea, Lesotho, Namibia, Zambia, Liberia, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania. So then, if you take the specter of socialism, quite a few countries in the liberation struggles put socialism as the forefront of their liberation philosophy. And with the decline of socialism and the Soviet bloc, eventually they departed from it, and some still have it. But countries like Algeria from 1962 to 2014 was explicitly a socialist country. Eritrea from 1911, Guinea-Bissau from 1973, Tanzania from 1964, Angola from 1967 to 1992, Benin from 1975, sorry, Angola from 1975 to 1992, Benin 1975-1990, Madagascar 1975-1992, Cape Verde 1975-1992, Chad 1962-1975, Republic of Congo 1970 to 1992, Ethiopia 1974 to 1991, Mozambique 1975 to 1990, Somalia 1969 to 1991, Djibouti 1981 to 1992, Egypt 1961 under Gabel Nasser, till 2007, Ghana 1960 to 1966, and Mali 1960 to 1991. What I'm saying is that somehow socialism was a very important narrative in Africa on the level of state policy. Then, obviously, liberalism is a big narrative in Africa. Many African universities are westernized based on the narratives taught in the West. And even in the liberation struggle, if you look at how Mandela articulated his ideology, this is what he said during this trial when he was convicted to prison. He said, from my reading of Marxist literature and from conversations with Marxists, I've gained the impression that communists regard the parliamentary system of the West as undemocratic and reactionary. But on the contrary, I'm an admirer of such a system. The Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, and the Bill of Rights are documents which are held in veneration by Democrats throughout the world. I have great respect for British political institutions and for the country's system of justice. Sorry. I regard the British Parliament as the most democratic institution in the world, and independence and impartiality of its judiciary never failed to arouse my admiration. The American Congress, that country's doctrines of separation of powers, as well as the independence of the judiciary, arouse in me similar sentiments. I've been influenced in my thinking by both West and East. This is the liberal narrative that Mandela once exposed. Then you have Pan-Africanism. It's a peculiar school of thought that was based on anti-colonialism and the legacy of the European slave trade. And its aim was to promote solidarity in Africa and the African diaspora. It led to the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, now called African Union, which is an organization of states. So Pan-Africanism, the ideology behind this of Africans having a common history and a common destiny, has been an important part both in the continent and in the diaspora. But if you look at possible contributions from African classical indigenous philosophy, you'll find a wide range in South Africa and Southern Africa. You have the Ubuntu philosophy, with the famous phrase, I am because we are, which put a relationship between individual and community. And one of his thinkers, Mugobe Ramose, has translated this idea of I am because we are into separate fields such as law, religion, politics, medicine, ecology. So Ubuntu can, make a big contribution from the African continent to new knowledge systems in a new world civilization. In Kenya, you have the Gikuyu community that has concepts of how to build a society based on justice, honesty, and generosity. This whole philosophical layout there that can be used in the African contribution to new knowledge system. In the West African Akan philosophy talks about personhood, and one of the philosophers, Kwasi Wirudu, makes a distinction between a human, a biological entity, and a person, an entity with special moral and metaphysical qualities, and discusses questions of free will, responsibilities, personhood in a different way than individualism and liberalism. In Nigeria, the Yoruba philosophy, one of the thinkers who wrote a book on gender, Oyeronke Oyewumi, says that gender is not a category in Yoruba society. So interesting book, because in the whole discussion on gender as a universal category, she argues that Yoruba society is not based on gender, but on age. Then another philosophy which had a big impact in Africa, obviously, was socialism. Liberation movements had to deal with socialism, they inspired by socialism, and so they had a big influence on Marxism, on liberation movements. And obviously, then the question is, how does it adapt to the African reality, because it was developed in Europe. Amilcar Cabral, who founded the African Party for Independence of Guinea and Cabo Verde, he says, our desire to develop a country with social justice and power in the hands of the people is our ideological basis. So he puts out, what are we fighting for? Social justice and power in the hands of the people. Never again do we want to see a group or a class of people exploiting or dominating the work of our people. That's our basis. And if you want to call it Marxism, you may call it Marxism. We're absolutely sure that we have to create and develop in our particular situation the solution for our country. So he's looking at whatever you call it, Marxism, but we adapt this idea to our specific situation. Julius Nyerere in Tanzania gives another way to adapt socialism to the African reality. He says, socialism, like democracy, is a state of mind. In a socialist society, it is the socialist attitude of mind and not the rigid adherence to a standard political pattern which is needed to ensure that the people care for each other's welfare. It has nothing to do with possession or not possession of wealth. That is, Marxism says about surplus value. He says, no, it's not about surplus value. Our first step must be, therefore, to re-educate ourselves, to regain a former attitude of mind. In our traditional African society, we were individuals within a community. We took care of the community, and the community took care of us. We neither needed nor wished to exploit or follow man. And in rejecting the capitalist attitude of mind which colonialism brought into Africa, we must also reject the capitalist method which goes with it. So he says, look, we are developing our own way of African socialism based on the African communitarian tradition. Thabo Mbeki, a former member of the South African Communist Party and a former president of South Africa in the period 1999 to 2008, he discusses the question of African civilization openly. He says, why can't an African worldview such as Ubuntu be at the center so that we can view other cultures in relation to it? Ubuntu, which reminds us that a person is a person through other people, does not allow for individualism that overrides the collective interests of a community. It stands in contradistinction to the idea that an individual is the be-all and end-all, without at the same time positioning that an individual is rightless or dispensable in the grand scheme of things. Ubuntu places a premium on the values of human solidarity, compassion, and human dignity. It is a lived philosophy which enables members of the community to achieve higher results through collective efforts. It is firmly based on recognizing the humanity in everyone. It emphasizes the importance of knowing oneself and accepting the uniqueness in all of us, so as to render meaningless the complex of inferiority and superiority. Indeed, Ubuntu connects all of humanity irrespective of ethnicity or racial origin. So He says we can take Ubuntu as a basic philosophy to build this idea of an African civilization. And he then goes to introduce the idea, the concept of African Renaissance. So, what is the African Renaissance? It is the establishment of democratic political systems to ensure the accomplishments of the goal that all people shall govern, deal with questions of democracy, peace, and stability, achieve sustainable economic development that results in the continuous improvements of the standard of living and the quality of life of the masses of the people, ensure the emancipation of women of Africa, and rediscovers African creative paths to recapture the people's cultures, encourage artistic creativity, and restore popular involvement in both accessing and advancing science and technology. He says, when we speak of African Renaissance, we speak of the rebirth and renewal of our continent. So link this to Ubuntu, saying that you develop a system of thought that addresses the major questions of today: democracy, peace, stability, economic development, quality of life, women's emancipation, all this art, science and technology. So he says we need to go to a renaissance, rebirth of these old ideas. And then he touches upon a question of who is an African. Because now in South Africa, the population consists of people who live there, the whites who were colonizers, the Asian population who came as indentured laborers from India. So how do you position all these people? And he gave a speech, I'm an African, to explain what in his concept in these modern times, Africanism means. He says, I owe my being to the Khoi and the sun who desolate souls hound the great expanses of the beautiful Cape, they who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They who were the first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and independence, and they who, as a people, perished in the result. I'm formed of the immigrants who left Europe to find a new home of our native lands. He means the white people. Whatever their own actions, they remain still part of me. Despite that they were colonialists and instituted apartheid, he says these white people living there, who came there, who have lived there for generations now, they're still part of Africa. I'm the grandchild who lays fresh flowers on the Boer graves at St. Helena in the Bahamas, and who sees in the mind's eyes and suffers the suffering of a simple peasant folk. That concentration camp destroyed home, a dream in ruins. And he's talking about the Boers who were oppressed by the English when the English invaded South Africa. I came of those who were transported from India and China, whose being resided in the fact solely that they were able to provide physical labor, who taught me that we could be both at home and be foreign, who taught me that human existence itself demanded that freedom was a necessary condition for that human existence. Being part of all these people, and in the knowledge that none dares contest that assertion, I shall claim that I am an African. So, Becky saying, whatever the history that brought people to live there in South Africa, at the end of the day, they are part of Africa now. They are not they came out of Africa, but they became African, and therefore they are part of the identity of Africans in South Africa. Now, there are many more thinkers and scholars in the African continent who contributed to ideas of an African civilization. I won't, have the time to do it. You could spend hours discussing it, but be assured that there are many there. I just give some classification to get an idea. Where do we draw on the ideas for new world civilization if you're talking about Africa. Then we go to the African diaspora, and I look into USA, Caribbean, Latin America, and Brazil. And this is all to do with the transatlantic, the European enslavement of Africans. Mind you, about 12 million people were kidnapped, captured from Africa. 10 million didn't survive the voyage to Abiyala. 2 million died. 2 million is quite a lot of people who died during the voyage. The biggest numbers went to to Brazil, which has the biggest was the biggest recipient of enslaved people. Then the British Caribbean and the French Caribbean, the Portuguese with 3.5 million, Great Britain with 2.6 million, France with 1.1 million, and then you have the USA, Spain, and the Netherlands with smaller numbers. Now, I'm going to spend some time to discuss the difference between the Black experience in the USA and the Caribbean. Often people bring them together as if it is the same, but it's not. To understand its history is important. The basis of the economy in the USA was cotton, in the Caribbean was sugar. The average size of a plantation in the United States was 30 people. The average size of the enslaved population in the Caribbean was between 115 up to 800, especially in the second half of the period of enslavement. In the USA, the Black population increased by 400%. At the end of slavery, there were more people who were Africans who were alive, while in the Caribbean, the population decreased at the end of slavery. In the British Caribbean, 50%, the population was 50%, and in the Netherlands, in Suriname, it was 90% was erased, didn't survive it. The share of the Black population in the United States is 10%. They are a minority in an overwhelmingly white society, while in the Caribbean, the Black population is overwhelmingly Black, 90%. So their struggle and the aim of the struggle is independence, while in the USA it's very different. Now, I spent some time on the USA because it has a big impact on the international discussions on the contribution of Africans to a new world civilization. To understand the Black struggle in the United States, you have to understand that the kind of wars, they were uprising, they were slave uprising, has been documented. Nat Turner is one of the most famous one, but compared to the Caribbean, the wars like you had in the Maroon Wars in different parts of the Caribbean and ultimately, obviously, in Haiti, you didn't have those kind of things in the USA. Now, slavery was abolished legally in 1865 after the Civil War in the United States. And that abolition of slavery inaugurated a period where blacks had civil rights, voting rights, equality before the law. The Ku Klux Klan was prohibited, and the leaders, the president, the leadership of the country at that time sought ways to integrate the South, where slavery was prevalent, into the national economy. And in that period called Reconstruction of 9 years, blacks enjoyed basically civil rights, but then you get a white betrayal. In order to integrate the South in the national economy, they introduced apartheid, racism, to satisfy the South, and new laws were introduced not only in the South but especially also in the North that restricted black freedom. And it introduced segregation, apartheid laws in different states. You get the rise of the Ku Klux Klans and the introduction of apartheid in the national law in a landmark case in 1896 called Homo Plessy versus Ferguson. That is the context in which you have to see the black struggle that came after slavery. But there were people who were enslaved, got their freedom by struggle, and played an important role after the abolition of slavery. Obviously, one of the important ones is Frederick Douglass, who lived from 1818 till 1895. Slavery was abolished in 1865. He escaped from slavery in 1838, worked with white abolitionists, wrote some interesting books, notably his autobiography, was a member of the Republican Party. The Republican Party at that time was a party for the abolition of slavery, while the Democratic Party was a party for slavery. You know, the progressive and reactionary labels were turned around at that time. He was an ambassador to Haiti and he traveled to Europe and played an important role in the black cause. Then, obviously, Harriet Tubman, born 1820 till 1913, escaped from slavery in 1948, was instrumental in setting up the Underground Railway, which was a network of secret routes and safe houses established in the United States to enable blacks to escape into free states and from there to Canada. After slavery, she was one of an influential voice in the campaign for women's rights and voting rights. Then Sojourner Truth, born 1797 until 1883, escaped from slavery in 1826, very famous for her speech Ain't a Woman, where she compiled calls for abolitionism with women's rights, voting rights, and property rights. Now, the landmark case, Homo Plessy versus Ferguson, was a court case where the judge, Howard Ferguson, took on the case of shoemaker Homo Plessy, who was an octoroon. An octoroon is somebody with 1/8 blood of black blood. Imagine, how they have this classification. In the United States, you have this one blood theory that if you have one drop of blood of black blood, you're black. While in the Caribbean, you have this scale of color. The whiter the colored people, were not seen as black but as colored. So you have color scale. While in the United States, you have the one drop theory that says if you have one drop of blood, then you're black, even if you have 7/8, like Homo Plessy, who was white. So he could go for, a white person. You wouldn't distinguish him. So in 1890, the state of Louisiana took a law that put a 20 days in jail or a $25 fine when a black sits in a white compartment of a train. So Plessy sat in the train, was arrested, and brought his case to the court and argued that the law of Louisiana was against the 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States that says slavery is abolished, and the 14th Amendment that says equal rights for blacks and whites are guaranteed by the Constitution. So you would say, well, it's against the Constitution, but when the legal system is part of the dominant system, you will lose. So the judge Ferguson refused his argument that it was against the 13th and 14th Amendment, And he says, I use a phrase, yes, you can be separate but equal. So saying that it was allowed to prohibit blacks, even the octoroon, to sit in the white compartment of a train. And by this, he instituted apartheid now as a national law, apartheid as part of the legal system. It was established now. So when you have this system, you attain freedom in a short period, be in reconstruction, but then you lose it again. What strategy do you have for liberation if you are a 10% minority? And this is basically the big question throughout the American history. And then you have major figures who comes up with answers. The most important figure after the abolition of slavery is Booker T. Washington, born in 1856, died in 1915. He was a businessman, born in slavery with a white father and a black mother. And he says, look, we shouldn't go for confrontation, but for cooperation with the whites. And we shouldn't focus on politics, but on economics. Build small businesses, get a job, set up a network of vocational training centers and firms, and a network of black key figures of preachers and businessmen. And he built the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama to train blacks to learn a trade. And the aim was, by learning a trade, you develop your self-esteem and dignity and self-worth. You provide for an income for yourself, your family, and your community. Now, for activists who are only for political struggle, cannot understand this. While Booker T. Washington clearly saw the need for economic empowerment of the blacks. And that's why he gained a lot of support in the community. Later, even from Marcus Garvey, who saw him as a role model. I'll come to Garvey later. But obviously, there are people who are saying, hey, it is about politics. It's not only about economic freedom. And W.E.B. Du Bois, born in 1868 and died in 1963, one of the founders of NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was an academic scholar and an activist, later a Marxist. And he says this is not only about work and income, it's about freedom. And he founded the Niagara movement in 1905 with other people and wanted to fight the apartheid law and the voting rights. And a few years later, in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People were founded, where blacks and whites were members. There was a big white influence in the NAACP. Einstein was a member of the Princeton branch. They had a monthly newspaper, The Crisis, and the main aim was equality before the law, and the instruments were lawsuits. Then you have within the United States this tradition of black communism. The Communist Party and the other left parties had black members. And the Comintern, the Communist International, in its fourth Congress, had a thesis dealing with the Negro questions. Basically, the argument was the Negroes, as they called the blacks at that time, the Africans, will be liberated with communism. Class struggle will liberate them. Once you have destroyed capitalism, you will destroy racism. And that tradition goes on from the 20s to the Black Panther parties as a vanguard parties, to the work of Angela Davis, who was a presidential candidate for the American Communist Party. So, and they focus on the relationship between race and class, and arguing that fighting racism through fighting capitalism is the best way. Then you get Marcus Garvey. And I think if you look in the African diaspora, I consider him the most important person in developing the idea of African civilization and how to deal with racism and how to understand it. Garfield was born in 1887, died in 1940. Was born in Jamaica, an activist and organizer there, went to Central America, was an admirer of Booker T. Washington, and finally settled in the United States where he built his international movement, which was amazing because he built an international movement with branches outside the US. And he was arguing, he says, look, white workers are also racist. Class is not the issue, race is. And so he says, Black unity, uniting with Africa, going back to Africa, the liberation of the mind, the whole concept of DTM comes from Garvey. That's where I pick it up, because he argues first that there was colonization of the mind and the need to decolonize the mind. So even in my book, Decolonizing the Mind, I refer to him as the basis for the book. And so Garvey says, look, if we want to build ourselves as Africans, as blacks, first you have to have economic power. So he takes up this idea of Booker T. Washington, and he set up black companies, restaurants, laundry companies, meeting halls. He set up a shipping line, magazines, publishing houses. 1 million member, he had paying dues. So he built an incredible organization for that time. And especially this idea that you need to go back to Africa because you won't have a future as a minority in America. That basically he says, look, we need to go back. And there were efforts, obviously. Sierra Leone was a British colony, and in 1787 and 1792, people from America and Maroons from Jamaica went to Sierra Leone, and Liberia was one of the countries founded by immigrants black immigrants from America. So the idea was not crazy at all. It was possible, but it was very difficult. Now, Garvey's movement went down. We could go into all the errors they've made, but their legacy is very important because the legacy went on into much of Pan-Africanism, and in the United States, in a group called the Nation of Islam, founded by a person named Wallace Fard Muhammad in the 1930s, and he has his own version of Islam, arguing that whites' race was the result of genetic experiments by scientist Yaqub, and the devils were white people with blue eyes, as Malcolm X put it. Nation of Islam was initially a group, basically sectarian group within the black community, but with the rise of Malcolm X and the civil rights movements in the 50s, it became more defined. And Malcolm X was basically the revolutionary voice that articulated the ideas about racism that were taught by Elijah Muhammad. So it were not just ideas of Malcolm, it were ideas that were taught in the Nation of Islam. There came a rift between Malcolm X and Muhammad. It led down to the downfall of the Nation of Islam. The son of Muhammad, Waliuddin, dissolved the Nation of Islam in 1976 and founded the American Society of Muslims and brought them back to Sunni Islam because the theology of Nation of Islam didn't resonate at all with classical Islam. And later on, as I said, Malcolm X made the Nation of Islam a national voice in the public arena, One of the major things is that he argued that the black struggle in the United States should not be limited to the United States, but should be brought to the forum, international forums like the United Nations, and it should go from civil rights to human rights. And that was a decolonial voice, linking racism in the United States to the struggle against colonization. And Malcolm was a master in analyzing the mechanisms of how the mind was colonized. He was assassinated on February 21, 1965. And in 1981, the Nation of Islam was reborn, refounded by Louis Farrakhan in 1981, who organized a Million Man March in 1996, and with a classical idea of uplifting blacks mentally. Now, to understand the black struggle in the United States, you have to understand the changing tides after World War II, where blacks were sent to Europe to fight for the rights of whites. But what about the rights of blacks in the United States? You fight against racism, anti-Semitism, Nazism in Europe, and when you come back, you live in a system of apartheid that is a racist system. And then internationally, you see decolonization, many countries becoming independent, and that had its impact in the United States. And one of the big impacts was that changing tide was in a landmark law case called Brown versus Board of Education. And Brown was Oliver Brown, whose daughter Linda, third grade, took a bus to a black school in Topeka, Kansas, while the white school was on walking distance, but she was not able to attend the white school. So they started a law case against the Board of Education, and the Supreme Court then says, yes, this prohibition, apartheid, is against the 14th Amendment that says that the equal rights for all. And the NAACP led this land case, was a big victory. And so the federal government says, oh, apartheid is against the federal law. What about the national states then? So then you get a lot of actions for equal rights in different ways. We have the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956, with Rosa Parks as a leading figure, and Martin Luther King, when Rosa Parks refused to sit on to give up her place in the front of the bus to white people. Blacks were required to sit in the back. You have judicial actions, non-violence, civil disobedience. White reacted with violence. In Little Rock in 1956, 1957, there was a fight for desegregation of primary and secondary schools. You have the sit-in actions in 1961, Surface Lunchroom in North Carolina. Congressman John Lewis played an important role in all these things. You have, the sit-ins developed as a national tactic by the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1961, you have the Congress of Racial Equality that organized Freedom Ride buses to the segregated states. And then you have Martin Luther King as a leading figure that articulated the strategy of nonviolent resistance, saying that in a country where blacks are 10%, how will you set up an armed struggle? That would be civil rights, that would be suicide. So he argued that you need, to have civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. He was arrested many more times than ever. Malcolm X was never arrested after he became politically active. He was arrested for other crimes before he became politically active. And King was murdered on April 4, 1968. And then this era, which is basically a short period of 10 years between, let's say, 1955 and 1965, you get all these, in a short period almost a revolution taking place in the US. 1961, you get voter registration. June 11, 1963, Kennedy gives a civil rights speech emphasizing equal rights for all. A day later, you have the murder of Medgar Evers, who was an NAACP field organizer and had a big impact in the struggle. August 28, 1963, you have the march on Washington to put pressure on the government. 1963, on November 22, the murder of John Kennedy. In 1964, you get the Civil Rights Act that prohibits segregation. In 1965, you get affirmative action. And all this took place in a very short period. And it was in the context of international changes taking place. You have the second Vietnam War, after the Vietnamese people defeated the French in the Dien Bien Phu in 1954. You get a second war that the United States gets involved in that lasted 20 years, from 1957 to 1975, brought down American imperialism in Asia. You have the Flower Power movement, feminism, the Student Revolt in 1968 in Paris, and the technological exchanges of contraception pills, the media bringing the war into living rooms. So many changes in the 30s, and we are now in a similar kind of historic era, where in a short period, many important changes will take place. I think the Ukraine war, the war in Palestine, is the beginning of something that will lead to a final either nuclear war or final decline of colonialism. And then you have another stream of thought within the American Black movement, going back to the historical legacy of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And after that, you get many activists and writers after slavery, Black women playing a crucial role in civil rights movement, in the Black Panther parties, in the Communist Party with Angela Davis. Black feminism became a narrative with Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, criticizing white feminism, and ending basically with the concept of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw that takes basically liberal theory and applies it to the combination of individualism, linking race, gender, and sexuality. I'll talk about these things in other episodes in more detail, but this is to give you an idea that the whole development in the US had an impact on Black in the diaspora and even in Africa. All these narratives, the names, the history and the struggle is common knowledge in the African diaspora and in Africa itself. And it had its impact that it weakened imperialism, it connected Pan-Africanism with international solidarity. Unfortunately, you see that there's another school where Black emancipation is embraced by imperialism and is used as an instrument of imperialism. I'll talk about that when I talk about intersectionality and so. And you see the CIA, the murdering agency of the United States, using intersectionality as a recruitment tool for the CIA. Now, so it's important to understand that the history of the Black struggle in the United States has a big impact internationally. I think that in the future development of the United States, we'll get another group will be very, very important, the so-called Latinos, people, with either like in Texas and in those parts who were formerly part of Mexico, and people coming from Latin America to the United States. Their demographics is changing. In 2005, 67% of the American population was white, 200 million people. And that percentage will decline. They will become a minority in 2050, 47%. Latinos, on the other hand, will grow from 14% to 29%, almost 30%. The black will stay around 13%. The Asians will grow, from 5 to 9%. So the demographics will change in the United States, with the Latino going to play a bigger role in the future. And then the question will be what will be their contribution to the social struggle in the United States. Now let's go to the Caribbean. When you talk about the Black contribution to changing the world, then you have to talk about the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was a truly humanitarian revolution. While the French Revolution was a racist revolution, it was a revolution for white people, because after the French Revolution, they abolished slavery for a short period in the French colonies and then reinstated slavery. That is the legacy of the French Revolution. But the legacy of the Haitian Revolution is that it connected first with indigenous struggle. You see it in the name. The French colony was named Saint-Domingue. And they named, after liberation, they named it Haiti. And Haiti is the name that the indigenous people gave for the area there. So they had a conscious decision in taking the name. They didn't give it an African name. They give it the name of the people who are living there. The leaders were very intelligent. They put internationalism at the front of their struggle. They organized armed resistance outside of Haiti. They stimulated resistance in many other Caribbean countries. There were trade routes through ships going through the Caribbean. So they had this contact. In Venezuela, Bolivar went to Haiti to seek help, and they got help in terms of weapons and even black generals helping to set up Bolivar's army. They had a vision of a new society based on social justice and eradication of racism. The Haitian Revolution now, Haiti, the name Haiti is connected with misery. And that is part of the colonization of the mind, and the way history has been written in such a way that those people who should have been the symbol of humanity and be celebrated are now seen as rubbish. So the Haitian Revolution was the biggest contribution that blacks made towards a new world civilization. We need to discuss the Haitian Revolution in more detail about what it meant and how it should be rewritten in the history book as the amazing feat beyond the French Revolution. Then you have new slave societies within the slave societies, where people liberated part of the lands in Brazil, in Suriname. They established communities where they lived in freedom, but had a peace treaty with the slave government in order to be able to exist. After slavery, you have basically two kinds of traditions developing in Black Caribbean. One is Black Marxism. Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, Oliver Cox. These are names of people who, from a Marxist perspective, looked at racism and at colonialism and made important contribution of how to analyze this and link it with colonialism. And then you have, outside of Marxism, many other contributions in the anti-colonial tradition. One is in economic theory, the plantation economy model by Lloyd Bess and George Beckford, where they analyze Caribbean societies and the economy as they are shaped by the institution of plantation, and argued that plantation economy, after the abolition of slavery, continued to exist, and somehow also linked to theorists in Latin Abiyala of dependencia. Then you have M. Césaire, Frantz Fanon, who focus on the mental legacy of colonialism, Eric Williams of Trinidad analyzing the relationship between capitalism and slavery, Caribbean feminism, Patricia Mohammed, Rora Radak, where they tried to develop a variant of feminism located within the Caribbean, and obviously the big movement for reparations with the Caribbean Reparation Commissions as a government intergovernmental institution addressing the issue of reparations. And then interesting is in Latin America, there's also a black school of thought, and I found one of the more interesting is the fusion of African and indigenous liberation. And the case of Tupac Amaru is an interesting case. Tupac Amaru was an Inca ruler, lived from 1545 to 1572, young guy who organized an armed revolt against the Spanish barbarians. He was finally captured and beheaded. The memory of his struggle lived on in the hearts and the minds of the Inca people. And 2 centuries later, a mestizo named Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, who lived from 1738 to 1791, and his Sambo wife, Micaela Bastidas, who lived from 1745 to 1781, they started a rebellion of native people in Peru against the Spanish colonizers and involved black people. A mestizo is a person of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, and a Sambo is of mixed indigenous and African ancestry. So Condorcanqui claimed direct lineage to Tupac Amaru and was called Tupac Amaru II. So in 1781, he and his family were captured. He was beheaded at the same place where Tupac Amaru I was beheaded, and he was forced to witness the execution of his wife and son before he was put to death. So you have this fusion of indigenous and black revolt and identity formation. Now you look at the identity of the people who are of mixed origins. And then Brazil. Brazil has the largest black population during slavery, became independent from Portugal in 1822, and was the latest to abolish slavery very late in 1889. While the British had abolished in 1838, the French in 1848, the Dutch in 1863, the Portuguese in 1888. And they have a history of maroon struggle. They call them Quilombo, with one of the largest communities, maroon communities in Palmeiras, community of 30,000 people, which was a state in a state. After the abolition of slavery, there's a large conglomerates of black movements, Brazilian Black Front, Black Experimental Theater led by Abdias do Nascimento, Black Cultural Association, Black Movement Against Discrimination, many black organizations addressing the issue of racism in the Brazilian society. But because it is all in Portuguese, it didn't become part of the international movement, and we should learn from them. So if we look at the African contribution to New World Civilization, we will have all the other contributions, but specifically the African indigenous philosophy, Pan-Africanism, and the experience of the diaspora will play an important role in shaping a New World Civilization. In the next episode, I'll talk about Oceania, developments in New Zealand and Australia. If you want to look about what I'm saying about all these things, part of it is in the book. You could look at through the index. The PowerPoint, you can download it through the website, www.sandahira.com. If you want to support this DTM channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, families, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe and like it. Get involved in discussion group. And if you want to make a donation, look at sandahira.com how you can do that. Thank you for your attention.